Welcome to all those who tuned into Anekdhara's webinar on Russia-Ukraine conflict, background analysis and likely prognosis. Both Ukraine and Russia trace their historical origins to the Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic tribes around 880 CE. The cultural and religious foundation laid during this period influenced the identities of both Ukraine and Russia. The following centuries, the regions to which these nations currently identify have seen a variety of changes. Ukraine, sandwiched between Western Europe in the west and Russia in the east, was influenced by different cultures, with Western Ukraine more prominently influenced, but also had a fair share of struggles with the powers on the west, Austro-Prussian Empire, Polish state, etc. In the east, it was Russian influence on the rule that was prominent. Following the First World War, Russian Revolution, Ukraine remained independent till around 1921, though it saw many governments with diverse ideologies. After integration into the USSR in 1922, it remained so till disintegration of USSR in 1991. However, there were many prominent people who tried to free Ukraine from USSR. They mainly operated from outside Soviet Union. Ukraine became independent post-dissolution of the USSR in 1991, but the internal tensions and interference of external powers remained. It is in this context we are discussing the topic of Russia-Ukraine conflict, background analysis and likely prognosis. Following the talk, we'll have a discussion. Please post your questions in the YouTube chat box and we'll collect them and convey to the speaker for his response. Speaking to us on the topic is Ambassador D.B.Venkatesh Varma. D.B.Venkatesh Varma. Ambassador D.B.Venkatesh Varma served the Indian Foreign Service from 1988 to 2021. During his diplomatic career, he worked in the Office of External Affairs Minister and in the Prime Minister's Office. He served as India's ambassador to Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, to the Kingdom of Spain, and to the Russian Federation until October 2021. He has vast experience in India's security and defense policies and served as Joint Secretary in charge of Disarmament and International Security in the Ministry of External Affairs. He was the first recipient of the S.K. Singh Award for Excellence in Indian Foreign Service in 2011 for his contribution to the negotiations of the Civil Nuclear Initiative. With 3 separate postings in Moscow, spanning 3 decades, Ambassador Varma has vast experience in India's strategic relations with Russia. As ambassador, he was closely involved with developing India's relations with Russia, including Prime Minister Modi's Act Far East Initiative, deepening of India's defense, nuclear, space, energy, commercial, science and technology, and cultural relations with Russia. He has spoken at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum and the Eastern Economic Forum on Vladivostok. It is this experience that we sought when we were looking for a speaker on this conflict, and we are indeed thankful to Ambassador Varma Garu for accepting our invite. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for that introduction, and greetings to all your viewers. I've been asked to speak on the background of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and just comment also on what will happen in the future. Of course, this has been a conflict of many surprises, so predicting the future is not easy, but we can see some trends. Now, as to the background, of course, the active hostilities began in February 2022 when Russia sent military forces into Ukraine, what it calls the special military operation. But it was clearly a military invasion of Ukraine that came about in February 2022. Having said that, I think the background to the conflict goes back a little deeper, a little into history. The more active phase of the conflict began in February of 2014, almost 12 years before our present period. Having said that, conflict was not inevitable. There is always a way to project conflicts as having a certain inevitability. As the introduction noted, Russians and Ukrainians are separate, but their histories have been very closely intertwined. So is their culture, their civilization, uh, their language is close, not similar, but close. They also have Slavic roots. Uh, they also, their Eastern Orthodox Church, there are also some strong similarities, although they are separate people. When the Soviet Union broke up, it must be remembered that the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were uh, chiefly responsible for the transition from the Soviet Union to uh, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which created independent states. The three leaders were President Boris Yeltsin of Russia, uh, President Kravchuk of Ukraine, and President Suskevich of Belarus. These were the three original founding countries of the Soviet Union, and they took upon themselves the right to abrogate that union, which of course disintegrated the Soviet Union itself. So the emergence of Ukraine and Russia as independent states in 1991 was a joint venture between Russia and Ukraine. So this is a historic fact that one should remember against the background of the current conflict, because it is often made out to be that Russia and Ukraine were always in a conflictual mode. That is really not so. In fact, for the first 2 decades after the breakup of the Soviet Union, relations with Russia and Ukraine were fairly friendly. There was no outright conflict between Russia and Ukraine. They had their differences, uh, but I think their ability to deal with these differences in the first 2 decades was much better than, of course, it is now. Of course, the main threshold of this changeover came about in 2014 when there was a change in government. President Yanukovych was, in a sense, forced to flee his democratically elected post in Kyiv, and the government in Kyiv passed on to uh, a new dispensation, which was very strongly anti-Russia and strongly pro-West, including their intention to have membership of the EU, European Union, and eventually membership of NATO. Membership of NATO was mentioned in 2002, but the Bucharest meeting in 2008 promised Ukraine and Georgia um, eventual membership, but no timeline was given. But the violent overthrow of the democratically elected government in February of 2014, I think, created a watershed movement where a country that had a large Russian representation, Russian minority representation in eastern part, Donbass as it's called, and a very pro-Western, pro-European dimension in the western part of Ukraine, was, I think, that balance was broken, and it shifted very much towards the west. But the path towards the current conflict, I think, went through the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, where I think for 6-7 years, both sides tried to see how the Minsk agreements could be implemented. It must be remembered the Minsk agreements and the Normandy format were not only endorsed by Russia and Ukraine, but also by the European Union, by the United States, and most importantly by the UN Security Council, which means that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council supported the Minsk agreements. Now, the Minsk agreements spoke about the unity and integrity of Ukraine as an independent state. But within the unity and integrity of Ukraine, eastern provinces would get a large measure of autonomy in terms of language, in terms of schooling, in terms of their self-governance, but within a united Ukraine. Now, it is quite possible that if the Minsk agreement had been successfully implemented, we would not come to this present pass where this issue is now being taken forward in earnest. Of course, there are Minsk agreement has itself become controversial since then, because Chancellor Merkel, in a interview she gave after she retired as Chancellor of Germany, quite clearly said that the Minsk agreements were not intended to arrive at a peaceful settlement. It was only intended to gain time for Ukraine to gain enough military strength to take on Russia. Now, this problem also is related to Russia incorporating Crimea in 2014 and the commencement of a civil war with strong Russian intervention, indirect participation in the Donbas area. So there was a civil war going on in the eastern provinces of Ukraine between 2015 and 2022. So this is the background that we should all remember in analyzing the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, when the war broke out in 2022, it has often been said that it is only the result of Russian aggression. It is the result of Russian expansionism, a new form of imperialism, autocracies being done. This is the Western narrative. But my own sense is that there were a number of opportunities for peace that could have been taken forward, which were lost, I must say, by both sides, both by Ukraine and Russia, for settlement of their differences. And their differences were on very large number of issues, on energy supplies, on military dimension. But the most important was on the treatment of Russian minorities in eastern Ukraine. The expansion of NATO is something that Russia had opposed ever since the beginning, in the mid-90s. There have been 5 waves of NATO expansion. Russia expressed its opposition at every expansion. The 5 of them took place. And because of Russian weakness, I think these opposition that was expressed by Russia actually fell on deaf ears. The West, particularly NATO, gradually came to the conclusion that Russia was too weak to oppose NATO expansion. And now this perception of Russian weakness, combined with a very strong shift within Ukraine for a membership of EU, which was not so controversial, but membership eventually of NATO, which proved to be finally controversial, combined together by the failure of the Minsk agreements, I think created the circumstances in which the present conflict has now entered its strong military phase. We must also remember that in summer of 2021, President Biden of the United States and President Putin of Russia met in Geneva, which was also another opportunity for addressing the problems. There were further opportunities for a diplomatic settlement when Russia proposed a number of proposals in December 2021, before the commencement of hostilities in February 2022, on the concept of making Ukraine a neutral state and NATO withdrawing its offensive capabilities to what it had in 1997. Why 1997? Because that is the year in which the Russia-NATO Founding Act was established, which created a framework for cooperative relations between Russia and NATO. We must remember in the 1990s, Russia was actually quite keen to join NATO. And when President Putin became president in the year 2000, for a couple of years, he himself expressed the view that maybe NATO membership was possible for Russia. So Russia-NATO relations were not always conflictual. In the 1990s, in fact, they were quite productive. So Russia proposed in December 2021 that if Ukraine were to return to formalized neutral status, something that would prevent NATO from establishing military bases in Ukraine right on its doorstep, then a way forward could be found. As that fell on deaf ears, there was no response, and Russia, of course, intervened militarily. It was a military invasion of an independent country, but a military invasion that clearly had a strong history, which I've just sort of um, just narrated. There was a further opportunity for peace when a couple of weeks into the military operations, Russia and Ukraine, which were parallelly talking to each other, including through the good offices of Belarus and finally Turkey, there was an agreement almost reached at the end of March, early April, between Russia and Ukraine on a possible settlement, which would actually included the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine proper in Donbass area in exchange for Ukraine neutrality. Of course, that was ostensibly rejected by Ukraine on advice of its Western partners, who basically advised Ukraine that why do you need to undertake this peace agreement, which was not in your interest, when there is a prospect of Russia being actually defeated on the battlefield. Now, the perception that Russia can be defeated in the battlefield, of course, began largely on account of Russian actions itself. Many of you would recall in between February 2022 and summer of 2022, up till September, Russian military performance in Ukraine was very mixed. In the south, the Russian army made considerable advances, including into Mariupol, and they were able to occupy the Sea of Azov area. But in the north, near Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv, the Russian military performance was not up to the mark. The Russian military made a number of mistakes. And Russia also agreed with the prospects for peace in the Istanbul peace talks by withdrawing their military forces. Now, this perception that Russia can be defeated, both militarily, was also reinforced by the very strong economic sanctions that were imposed on Russia in 2022, which created the expectation that Russia would be under pressure economically, and this in turn would create pressure on the political leadership to back off and withdraw the military forces from Ukraine. So in 2022, the prospects for peace were, in fact, little prospects for peace that emerged in March and April of 2022. The doors were finally fully shut by the end of the year, when Russia actually was on the defensive militarily. The military situation, of course, changed in the year 2023, last year, where Russia, having withdrawn from areas around Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv, created the basis for Russia to consolidate its military forces. So Russia withdrew from the north, but actually consolidated its forces in the south and the east of Ukraine. Now, the results of this, and Russia also changed its military tactics from a strategy of maneuver to a strategy of attrition of Ukrainian forces, which is what is called positional warfare. This, of course, led to some significant military successes of Russia in the year 2023, the most important being the battle for the city of Bakhmut, and subsequently followed by the battle for Avdiivka, which, of course, turned the tide in Russia's favor. Russia was not winning the war, but Russia had gained the upper hand in the year 2023. Subsequently, in the year 2024, in the first 5 months of this year, Russia has been able to consolidate its military position, and presently it is undertaking quite significant military operations, again in the north, opposite Kharkiv. It is almost 20 kilometers from Kharkiv, from the Russian border. And it is making considerable gains in Kharkiv and in Sumy, which is expected to be another thrust. Now, why are these two military operations significant in the larger picture? Because Ukraine is short of military forces. Ukraine has gone through 3 or 4 mobilizations. So it is short of fighting men and women of fighting age. There have been a number of people who have relocated to countries in Europe as refugees. The fighting manpower strength of Ukraine is now under considerable stress. In comparison, the fighting capacity of Russia, which was quite weak in 2022, has steadily been consolidated. There was one mobilization in Russia, which created the basis for Russia to consolidate and increase its military forces. And this period has also enabled Russia to increase its defense production. In fact, the Russian defense budget has almost been risen to 6.77% of GDP from about 3%. So this is a very large increase in defense production of Russia. The Russian armed forces now are getting more equipment, largely from domestic manufacture, because the Russian defense industry has rebounded in a very major way. And the Russian military has also learned some hard lessons, which they have incorporated into their military strategy. In economic terms, the Russian economy has withstood the initial thrust of sanctions. It has not impacted on the Russian ability to conduct the war. But as time has progressed, Russian ability to conduct the war, despite the sanctions, have only increased. We will come to the sanctions issue in a moment. With respect to Ukraine, we've discussed briefly the difficulty they're having in manpower. They also had a difficulty in equipment. Ukraine initially fought the war in 2022 with its own equipment, what it already had. In late 22, 23, it has fought with equipment that was ex-Warsaw Pact equipment that was supplied by NATO countries from Europe and some assistance from the United States. Today, it is fighting almost entirely with all the main equipment that is coming up is fighting, which has been supplied by NATO and the United States of America. Now, the quality of equipment, of course, has risen over a period of time. So there has been an escalation in terms of equipment that is being supplied by the West to Ukraine. Initially, it was just artillery, long-range artillery. Then it was battle tanks. And now F-16s are expected to come. A tank, long-range cruise missiles are being supplied by France, by the United States. There has also been an escalation of targets. Initially, Western assistance to Ukraine was based only on the condition that Ukrainian army was free to hit Russian targets, but within Ukraine, or hit targets in Crimea or the Kerch Bridge, which connects mainland Russia to Crimea. But gradually, there have been increasing attacks within Russia, which are now becoming more and more prominent, including close by cities such as Belgorod, oil refineries, and some attacks have also taken place on airports. 1 or 2 attacks by drones have also taken place in Moscow. Now, the escalation is reaching a new level now because I think the West is now quite prepared to allow its long-range attack missiles to be used by Ukraine to hit targets within Russia. Now, how Russia will react, we don't know, but this will be a major, escalation in the conflict. But apart from the military operations in Ukraine, there is also the operations that are taking place in the economic side. There too, there has been a steady escalation of sanctions. Sanctions were initially imposed in a very strong manner in the economic trade side, financial side, banking side, energy energy sector, transportation sector. Aeroflot doesn't fly to many parts of the West. Overflight for European flights over Russia have been stopped. So there's been a large dislocation of transportation linkages, quite apart from the linkages with the international banking system. But the new escalations that are now coming up is that the West is considering, including at the G7 meeting, the summit that is going to come up in Italy, G7 are considering measures to use the financial assets confiscated from the central bank of Russia, which are lying 80%, 85% are lying in Europe, about 10, 15%, or little less than that in America. They are wanting to utilize this to lend support to Ukraine, give financial support to Ukraine. Now, there are very serious international law implications of such action. So an interim measure that the G7 is considering is not to touch the main amounts of central bank deposits of Russia in the Western banks, but to use the interest that has accrued over this 2-3 years to be used by Ukraine. Even that can have strong international law implications on the sanctity of deposits, of central bank deposits, especially kept in foreign banks, and it will have a major impact on how countries all over the world keep their foreign exchange reserves, whether they keep it in their own country, in what currency they keep, whether they can keep it abroad, if you keep it abroad, in what currency and in which banks, and whether these reserves will be subject to what are unilateral sanctions that can be imposed either by the United States or by the EU. So there is a slight element of de-dollarization. A motive for de-dollarization is actually becoming pretty strong. Of course, the process itself is still fairly modest given the large dominance that the dollar has in the international economy. Now, with respect to domestic support, this too has gone through various phases. I think in 2022, President Zelensky had very strong support domestically and also internationally on the fact that Ukraine was resisting Russian aggression, as was being portrayed in the Western narrative as a fight between democracy and autocracy. But over a period of time, I think this narrative has lost credence. Definitely in the global south, I think there are very few takers to this proposition that it is a fight between democracy and autocracy, but also in Europe and slowly also in the United States of America. So therefore, when the latest congressional budget allocation was given, about $60 billion for Ukraine, it was after a very long debate and a very contentious debate, especially from the Republican Party, which is now questioning the need and the scale of support that was supposed to be given to Ukraine. Of course, it was finally passed. The Ukrainian aid bill was finally passed, but it must be remembered it was finally passed along with the support to Israel and to Taiwan, and it was like a package thing. It is fairly substantial, and at least for this year, Ukraine will be having that ability to. Now, the prospects for peace, there are a number of peace proposals on the table. The peace proposals, I think, have very little chance of success presently, because there is no peace proposal on which both Russia and Ukraine are prepared to talk. President Zelensky of Ukraine has put forward what is called the 10-point program, plan for peace. China has put forward their own plan, which is about 11 or 12 points. South Africa and the African countries have put forward something else. So there are a number of proposals on the table. What Russia is saying is that they are quite prepared to go back to the documents that were discussed in Istanbul in February 2022, in March and April, February of year 2022, provided the current situation on the battlefield is also taken into account, which is essentially to say that the 4 provinces in Donbass, which have been formally incorporated into the Russian Federation through a constitutional amendment, is also taken into account. It's on the table. It is something that that Russia insists that that reality should be taken into account in that. Of course, this contradicts completely the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty that is being pushed by the West and is the central heart of the Zelensky proposals that have been put forward. But while President Zelensky's proposal of Ukraine had some credibility in 2022 because of the fluid military situation, it is difficult to correlate the President Zelensky's proposals along with the military situation today as it obtains in the summer of 2024. There is a proposal for a peace conference that is to be held in mid-June, where Ukraine will be there, of course, and a number of countries have been invited, except Russia. Now, there is, of course, the obvious fact, it doesn't take much to analyze that you cannot have a peace conference with only one side, one party to the peace process being present, while the other side, which is actually gaining an upper hand on the military situation on the battlefield, is not present, is not been invited, has not received an invitation, and even if it receives an invitation, it is unknown whether they will accept the invitation to come in this immediate context, because while Ukraine's interest in peace, Ukraine and its backers' interest in peace is now more now because they wish to create a diplomatic momentum in favor of peace. But the diplomatic momentum has to go hand in hand with the military ground situation. Because if the diplomatic momentum could have been taken forward without a reference to the ground situation, then maybe we could have turned the clock back to the proposals of December 2022. But at the heart of the peace process are 3 factors. And whether they come up this year, whether they come up next year, or the year after, I don't know. That depends on how the situation changes. One is, what is the status of territory that belonged to Ukraine and now has been militarily occupied by Russia? Which part of that would be with Ukraine and which part of that, part of the peace settlement, will go to Russia? Second is the issue of the future status of Ukraine as a country that is neutral, as a country that remains independent but not neutral, or as a country that joins NATO or has strong NATO presence on NATO forces on its territory. Now, and the third is the other dimensions of the war, which is cybersecurity, information war, economic sanctions, the imposition, the utilization of Russian assets, confiscation of assets, and this series of confiscation of assets by both sides, by Europeans of Russian assets, Americans of Russian assets, and Russia of European and American assets in Russia. So this is again a very complicated legal situation which cannot be resolved in one go, but that will also be part of the longer peace process. And the last thing is, of course, there's various cases that have been imposed or alleged to have been imposed on the ICC and things like that, which and the return of prisoners, the humanitarian aspects, the eventual reconstruction of Ukraine. So the peace agenda will have to be very carefully constructed. But I think before realistic prospects of peace can come, I think both the military situation and the economic sanctions situation will actually escalate. uh, before we come to another phase in this conflict where the prospects for peace will become brighter. Presently, neither side is exhausted militarily, neither Ukraine nor Russia. But if military exhaustion is a factor, of course, then the onus is more on Ukraine than on Russia. But if diplomatic support for Ukraine is considered, the Western support for Ukraine is still at a very high level. Of course, this can change due to domestic changes in Ukraine, in Europe. They can also change due to domestic changes in the United States of America. We all know that there will be presidential elections in November of this year. And the domestic changes both in Russia and in Ukraine. And this is a significant factor because President Zelensky's official presidential term has come to an end on 20th of May, in fact, this month. Though under emergency decree of the war, ongoing war, his tenure has been extended. President Putin contested an election and he received a fairly substantive support from the Russian people in the nature of the support that he received. So in a sense, Russia's policy, President Putin's policy on Ukraine has, in a sense, been received the confidence of the Russian people. So a new political cycle is beginning in Russia. So the old political cycle has completed in Ukraine, has not begun, and a new political cycle has begun in Russia. Of course, the war, we have discussed this as Russia-Ukraine war conflict, but clearly it is not limited to Russia and Ukraine. It is in reality a war, a conflict between Russia and the West, between NATO. And how quickly it will come down, it is difficult to say because, as I said, the factors leading to escalation presently are stronger than the factors leading to peace. It's an unfortunate conclusion to reach, but that is, in fact, the reality. The war has also impacted largely on the international system. The old structures of deterrence between the big powers is now under great stress. In fact, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in a sense, is a failure of deterrence between Russia and the United States of America. Both nuclear armed powers. NATO is a nuclear alliance. And this is a conflict which is currently short of active conflict between the two. But if there are NATO forces to be deployed in Ukraine now, is during the conflict or post the peace settlement, of course, this conflict friction points will continue into the foreseeable future. It has greatly impacted on European security. The old structures of European security are over. NATO has expanded. All the three Scandinavian countries have also joined NATO, which is Finland and Sweden, along with Norway, which was already a NATO member. So NATO's front with Russia has expanded, almost doubled. But a doubling of the front with the same capabilities, or in fact depleted capabilities because of the support that NATO forces have given to Ukraine, actually has weakened NATO in the short term rather than strengthened NATO. So this notion that is often read in the press that NATO has expanded and therefore has gotten strengthened, I think is in closer examination, you will find that double the commitments with the same capabilities or less than the same capabilities actually means a weakening of the alliance structure. There will be a NATO summit in soon, next month, and that will take place in Washington. There is a very strong drive for increased NATO defense expenditure. Only 3 or 4 countries actually meet the NATO deadline of commitment of 2% of GDP. Many countries, the United States does more than 2% of GDP. Poland, the Baltic states, these do more than 2% of GDP, but many of the big powers, France and Germany, France is much better, Germany is much less. Canada, which makes such noise on Ukrainian security, is in fact one of the lowest spenders in NATO. Military spending is expected to rise dramatically. This is a period of great war mobilization in different aspects, not just in economic terms, in defense industry terms. There will be more recruitment. Some of the countries are going back into conscription. So this is a long drawn conflict, and NATO-Russia conflict will not just be limited to what will happen with regard to Ukraine, which of course is a very important dimension of the conflict. But there is Baltic security, there is security in the Arctic Sea, there is a problem with respect to the Black Sea area, something in the Caucasus. There is a contestation for influence in Georgia, which is another country that the West is seen as a possible way of weaning away from Russia. There is a conflict also in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So you pull at one of the strings of the canvas, a lot of the canvas can come apart. It has also had a deep impact on energy relations. The impact is quite dramatic and far-reaching. Europe is now no longer the main destination of Russian European energy supplies. That has given an opportunity for China to benefit from the pivot to the east because of the markets that China provides for Russia. We recently saw the summit between President Putin and President Xi in Beijing, which shows that Russia and China have moved closer together. There's a strong element of strategic convergence. I would not say that it is already a military alliance. In fact, a military alliance is not something that neither Russia nor China are capable of doing, because their overall global strategic interests are not the same, except for the fact that the United States, because of its policies in Europe, is driving Russia and China closer together. Their geopolitical position, their military capabilities are quite distinct. China can do very little to support directly Russian military activity in Ukraine, apart from supplies of dual-use items and being a big market. And if there were to be a conflict between the US and China, or say over Taiwan in the South China Sea or in the Indo-Pacific region, apart from political and diplomatic support, there is little that Russia can do to help China, except if the global confrontation between the big powers reaches a nuclear level, where the three big powers confront each other not only in a conventional sense, but also in a nuclear sense, and there's a global mobilization of forces across the Eurasian continent. Of course, that is a very extreme case, but short of an extreme case, if it were to be a limited case of conflicts between Russia and NATO in Europe, and China and the United States in the Indo-Pacific, both Russia and China have distinct interests and not the same, automatically the same interests. This said, the geopolitical position of the three big powers is, of course, being deeply impacted. Russia is fighting this war in Ukraine. There's no early end to that war. Having said that, it may gain militarily the upper hand, but it is, of course, on the back foot in as far as European security is concerned. Europe itself is again on the back foot, both economically, militarily, and Europe is unable to answer a question that has been central to European security for the last 300 years, which is, how do you have European security without the involvement of Russia? They are unable to think about this presently, logically, clearly, because they have pursued this notion that the purpose of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the main purpose of Western assistance to Ukraine for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is the so-called strategic defeat of Russia. Now, whether that will happen or not, I don't know. It doesn't seem so. If you see the military situation, it doesn't seem so on the limited impact of sanctions. It doesn't seem so because Russia seemed to enjoy a considerable amount of support in the global south. With respect to the United States of America, of course, it is now deeply involved, not just in the military security of Europe through an expanded NATO. And we should not forget that almost 80% of NATO funding and NATO's military capabilities is that from the United States of America. So for all the talk that we hear of European security, strategic autonomy in France or Germany, Germans don't say that, but the French say it. But the reality on the ground is that the United States provides the key backbone and the fighting strength for NATO in Europe. Due to the developments of the Middle East, we are all noticing the United States is also deeply involved in this conflict between Israel and the Palestinian, the larger security situation in the Middle East. And we also are now witnessing a major rise in military assertion that China is showing vis-a-vis Taiwan, which has now become a pattern of Chinese behavior in our part of the world. So therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that the United States is a very strong power, but it's an overextended power. That leaves China, which is in a more comfortable position geopolitically of trying to address what its interests are, pick and choose when it wants to deal with Russia, when it wants to deal with the United States. So in this triangular relationship, China presently has an advantage. And it's an advantage that it has, not only it has sought, but it's an advantage that American policy has given. It's an advantage that Russian actions in Ukraine have provided for China. Having said this, let me end by briefly referring to our position, India's position. Like many countries in the global south, I think India was uncomfortable with the outbreak of open hostilities, the use of military force against and our support for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. But having said that, I think India has not condemned Russia, largely in account of the fact that we have not agreed with the Western narrative on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Unfortunate as it is of the use of military force, we clearly see a background to this. The war did not begin on February 2022. There were reasons for this, which I've tried to explain. There's a background to this, which I've narrated at the beginning of my talk. But more fundamentally, I think India's position has been that war is never a guarantor of a durable peace settlement. So a peace settlement is obviously necessary. Prime Minister Modi very clearly told President Putin in Samarkand that this is not an era of war. Indian diplomacy achieved a very big success when we were able to get a consensus document for the G20. And the four or five paragraphs in the G20 statement on Ukraine are the only consensus paragraphs that have been agreed to by all the big players even today. There is no other document where both the G7, the United States, the key NATO countries, and Russia and China, and major countries of the global south, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, have agreed to. So that I think was a major diplomatic success. India is also engaged with Russia during this period. We have not implemented the sanctions. In fact, our deep engagement with all the main players has also given us economic dividends in the sense that we have been able to source discounted Russian energy supplies on the international market, which I think has saved for India almost $7 to $8 billion worth of benefit that we have. It is also not only for India's benefit, but it is also a benefit for the stability of the global energy markets, because a quick dip in a major supply-demand situation is largely disrupted, which could have been the result if there was a complete embargo on Russian energy sources into the international market. And fortunately, that has not happened. But India and China have been the major players in this. But the energy market has also changed quite dramatically. The larger energy scene in the world, climate change goals have now been either postponed or set aside, particularly in Europe. Energy flows in different parts of the world have also been. There is also a new awakening in the global south, which we saw partly in the G20, but it is also seen in the impact that is had in the increased interest in membership of BRICS countries. There are about 25, 30 countries who are interested in BRICS, but BRICS has already been expanded to 11 countries in the last BRICS summit. And there's a BRICS summit coming up in Russia and things like that. So the move towards multipolarity, I think, is well on its way. It's an uneven process. It is a contested process. There is more conflict coming our way. I mean, unfortunately, that appears to be the case. The big powers are not necessarily providing leadership. We've seen this particularly in the paralysis that has overtaken the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council, and the limits of the effectiveness of the UN with respect to the current composition of the permanent five is obvious to all, and that of course gives us an added argument, an added evidence to show why the reform of the global institutions is absolutely necessary by taking in new blood, new players such as India to go forward. But the global south is not just limited to India. There's a awakening in Southeast Asia, in the Gulf, in the Middle East countries are more active. The African countries are definitely have a views of their own, and Latin America too is now coming up. So though we live in a very troubled world, it is important that India remains engaged, and I think India has shown considerable amount of leadership. But as we move forward to the rest of the year, India should remain fully engaged. I will end there. I will just, if those of you who have further interest in this, I've written 3 articles in the Indian Express which were published on the 24th of February 2022, 24th of February 2023, and 24th of February 2024. So it's easy to remember. It's the 24th of February, which is the beginning of the war. And I've written 3 articles, and if you wish to see my analysis, I'd encourage you to see that. Let me stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that the viewers of this program might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Varmaji. This is a wonderful overview and that you gave, starting with a historical background towards the Ukraine-Russian conflict, and then coming back to what the current situation would be with the difference vis-a-vis different powers. And we do have certain questions which audience have posed. Of course, this I think is already addressed. Can you delineate the role of different powers in current war and also prior to that? So the current war you have delineated, but prior to that, also to some extent you made it clear. But would you like to add anything to this point, or can we skip it?
No, I've tried to address this point in this. What actually comes out is that though the conflict is framed as Russia-Ukraine conflict, it is clearly not limited to Ukraine itself. And big powers tend to relate to that conflict in respect of their own interests. Now, when smaller powers like Ukraine get caught up in a larger confrontation between Russia and the United States, then Ukraine's own interests tend to take a backseat. And this is a classical definition of a proxy conflict. So it is not just a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine being used as a lever for conflict between Russia and NATO. And now, of course, there'll be strong views on whether who's to blame for this. Now, there is a very strong narrative that this was from the West, which is to say that the blame lies entirely with Russia, that this was an unprovoked aggression. Ukraine is the innocent victim. Ukraine has rights in terms of international law, in terms of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And further, that Ukraine has the unlimited right to choose its security alliances, including membership of NATO. So this notion that is given from the West is that no country, particularly Russia, should have a veto on Ukraine's security choices. Now, in theory, all this is fine. I mean, you can make an argument, but a theoretical argument divorced from reality and divorced from geopolitics and divorced from historical trends will create a situation like Ukraine finds itself in. We need to ask ourselves the question, is Ukraine in control of its fate today in 2024 more than it is in control of its fate in 2022? I mean, my view is no. They are fighting on the front with their own men and women, very heroically, I must say, but are critically dependent on external support. And external support can vary, it can be whimsical. It is subject to the political winds that are taking place in changes that take place in major European countries and the United States of America. So if you make your independence, your sovereignty, and particularly your territorial integrity subject to external support, then you have to take both the benefits and the risks that come about. And if you are a proxy war, if you are subject to a proxy war between Russia and the United States of America, then the risks, of course, increase over a period of time. And what are the risks? The risks are that Russia and the United States may eventually make a deal which conforms to their interests rather than the interests of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine will be, or whether it will be in a position, of course, the Western argument today, and especially from the United States, is that the deal has to be between Russia and Ukraine, though the United States has very strong views on how European security, NATO security will be constructed and things like that. Now, if Russia were to perform very poorly in the war, then of course it has to do a deal with Ukraine. But if it prevails in the war with Ukraine, don't be surprised if the Russians say that Ukraine is only part of the problem. We want to do a deal with with NATO. Presently, the answer is no. There will be no deal with Russia. But let's see how things turn out in the next year or so. So the lesson to be learned for us is that when you give control over your vital interests, what are your vital interests of any country, of its independence, in policy making, in independence in its ability to conduct wars. If you start believing that you will start fighting other people's wars in the hope that other people will fight your wars, then the Ukraine situation is a good example of how the real world actually works. So for those of us who have these fanciful views of how the world actually works, I think a closer look at the Ukraine situation will hopefully provide a few lessons and few answers.
Thank you, sir. That's good addition to what you already said. There is this question on the Wagner Group. What is the role of Wagner Group in Ukraine war? And why did Russia have so much emphasis on these informal groups?
Yeah, so the Wagner Group was a paramilitary group which had the blessings of the Russian state. over a period of time. It was active in various parts of the world, including in Africa, in uh, in uh, uh, in in different parts of North Africa as well, but also in Ukraine. And initially in 2022 and 2023, when the Russian army was not performing very well and was recouping, in fact, particularly in the Battle of Bakhmut, the Wagner Group played a very important role. Now, these paramilitaries, which are controlled by states, which are not actually part of the regular military forces, is not limited just to Russia. Is not limited just to Wagner Group. There are many other paramilitary groups that are also active in Ukraine. They're active in many other civil wars in different parts of the world, including in the Middle East, in Africa, and things like that, which is, of course, not a good trend where you have paramilitaries which are taking place. But the Wagner Group ran into particular difficulty when we saw how its political ambitions, particularly of its so-called leader, took it in direct confrontation with the Russian military and particularly with the Kremlin. And that was sorted out in a very Russian sort of way. So that has been taken out, and I think it was a lesson that was learned, that if you run many paramilitaries, finally it's a tiger that you cannot dismount. The tiger will bite you if you dismount. So that's the lesson that has been done, and especially in the Russian military situation, the role of the paramilitaries has been decreased considerably. The Russian military general staff is now taking more interest, more direct control over many of the military operations. But this problem of paramilitaries ostensibly supported by states but having no direct role of the states is a phenomenon that will continue to be seen in international situations all across the world. Today there are almost 189 conflicts taking place in different parts of the world. This is a figure that was provided by the IISS based in London. They did a survey of how many conflicts are there in the world in 2023, end of 2023. There are more than 180 conflicts, and many of them deal with terror groups and paramilitaries, often supported by states, often acting as proxies to distant powers. So this is something that we should watch very carefully.
Thank you, sir. Next question is, how can a country like India, which has consistently opposed territorial aggression by neighboring countries, justify its stand in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? You did refer to it, but would you like to add anything more to it?
Yes, of course. Acquisition of territory through the use of military force is something that we do not support. It is contrary to the principle of the UN Charter. The concept of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states is something that should be protected. Sovereignty and territorial integrity of states is a sacred flame. And the sacred flame has to be protected through sensible policy. It is not a flame that is self-perpetuating. This is a very real world we live in. So the lesson to be learned is that if you want to protect your own sovereignty and territorial integrity, you depend on your own resources and use sensible policies. And one of the pillars of the sensible policies, lessons of principal policies, is that when you deal with the big powers will turn your interest into their interest. And tragically, Ukraine is a very good example of that. So we do not justify territorial acquisition through the use of military force. But that's the principle that has to be taken forward through sensible policy. And hopefully we have succeeded so far in pursuing that sensible policy. And I'm confident that in the future also India will take its protection of its interests in the right manner possible. The Ukraine example shows how it should not be done. Especially the risks that entail if you follow a policy of protection of your security interests through the support of external powers.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, Narrative of the war between democratic and dictatorial forces got discredited to whatever extent. Is the real justification of war is only territorial integrity of a nation? This question.
You see, there's simplification of democracy, fight between democracies and autocracies. I think, I mean, even the West has stopped saying it about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but the Russia-Ukraine conflict has changed over a period of time. So just to say that it's a fight between democratic Ukraine and an autocratic Russia is a simplification that actually has very few takers. The war itself is a test of how do you conduct interstate relations where conflict is not inevitable, but conflict slips into conflict because of the failure of diplomacy and dialogue. I tried to explain in my presentation that there were opportunities for peace which were lost by both sides. But I have also said that military aggression does not provide enduring peace settlements. So there are limits to which use of military force can actually also create the basis for security for countries, because total security for one country is amounts to insecurity for another set of countries. So there has to be a sense of accommodation, a sense of compromise. Dialogue has to be restored, accommodation has to be restored. And as I said, how can you construct European security without the participation of Russia? I mean, this notion that has arisen in Europe, particularly the European Union and NATO, that they will pursue a permanent a policy of permanent conflict with Russia until there is a strategic defeat of Russia, in my view, is I think not the right way to proceed, which also imposes on Russia the obligation to conclude this conflict as quickly as possible and construct a peace settlement that will take into the interests of Russia, obviously, but also the interests of Ukraine as part of a larger security structure.
There are three questions of China. You already handled, discussed about China's advantageous position that it has acquired in this as a part of this conflict. So I'll just combine the questions and then pose it as one question. How far China's advantageous position weakened India's strategic and diplomatic? Within brackets, economically we are not a match. Abilities to deal with China and other influential nations. Continuation to that is, how is India going to get advantage over other countries if China is closer to Russia?
Well, of course, relations amongst the big powers is something that we have to watch very carefully. I tried to explain that Russia has now quite long-term difficulties in part of its European security. Russia contributing to European security, being part of European security is important for us because we want balance on the Eurasian continent. If we want balance on the Eurasian continent is important for us because we do not wish to see a situation where China takes unilateral advantage of the power vacuum that arises from these disturbances in security. The United States, which is our other partner, is clearly overextended about continuing war in Europe, its problems of ensuring security in the Middle East for Israel, the conflict that is now brewing in the Indo-Pacific with regard to an asset of China. Now, these are all global trends that we should watch very carefully. I don't think India loses one way or the other automatically, but clearly this is a reference point for our own engagement, so that our partners, particularly Russia, which we have a very strong strategic partnership for over many decades, and our relationship with the United States, which is a very important strategic partnership relationship we have, not just bilaterally, but also globally. The less conflict there is in the world, the less strain it poses on these two key strategic conflicts. strategic relationships we have with our two big partners, which is Russia and the United States, and also with Europe. I mean, for example, France is a very important partner for us, and it is better for us that European security comes back into its own, to a certain sense of normalcy as well. We have a relationship of both cooperation and conflict with China. Naturally, if the geopolitical situation moves in China's favor, China would naturally want to use that advantage to its own, for its own needs. And of course, India is no pushover. You know, we are not a small country to be pushed aside by other big powers. But clearly, if the international situation were to return to a certain sense of normalcy and balance, a certain sense of equilibrium in the amongst the big powers, will also reduce the chances of conflict in the international system. And for us, a growing economy, we will be the third largest economy in the next couple of years, and will remain so for the next 3 decades. A stable international system is very important for our economic, trade, technology engagement, for our markets, for our capital, for the Indian diaspora. There are so many other implications are there. So for us, naturally, we have an interest in a more stable, less conflict-ridden international system for our own interests, and we would very much want to see this moving forward. Whether China gains advantage over India and weakens India, I don't think so. As I said, we are no pushover country. We have our own interests, we have our own capabilities, but that doesn't mean that we should be oblivious of the larger international trends, which is something that I've tried to. So I think answered many of these questions in my own presentation. So if there are no new questions, I think maybe we can bring this to an end.
There's one question which may be of interest. With fall of socialist state in that is the USSR, why did US still maintain its tough stance on current Russian Federation? Why was it not cooperative with the Russian Federation?
Well, that is a lesson in international politics. If you are strong, you tend to dominate. That is what the United States did. So we should not be surprised by how big powers behave. It's a lesson for us also, because if we wish to have a balance of power globally, then India should be one of the poles. We have good intentions, we have good policies, but finally we need to depend on our own strength, and that is the meaning of multipolarity. India should be one of the multiple poles of the multipolar world. And the first definition of a pole is that your ability to stand on your own 2 feet and think for yourselves and act with your capabilities. Because if you show weakness, the international system does not really give much space to weak countries. So I think we've answered many of the questions that have come. So maybe we can bring this to a close.
Yes. So, yeah. Thank you, Ambassador D.B. Varma Venkatesh Varma for the excellent talk. In fact, there were also praises which were coming in on the chat box. I just read out a few. The talk is very informative and excellent. It was from one of the speaker. The other said, very nice talk. And not only covered conflict in a very narrow sense, but widened it to cover the international relations and implications at various levels for different countries. That's quite nice of you, and also gives an overview to our audience of what exactly is happening in the current scenario, and also likely scenarios that might emerge. So that's very nice of you. Thank you very much for accepting our invite and also giving this such an illuminating talk. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
And my thanks to our technical team supported by Sadiq, which is done all the technical support to us. And our next webinar is on 30th of June. It will be an agrarian crisis and food security. role of government and role of private sector. So with this, we conclude this webinar. And thank you once again, Varma garu. Thank you very much.